Thank you. Yes, thank you all, everyone. And thank you for organizing this event. Richard, thank you for inviting me to comment this wonderful book. And of course, thank you, Maximo, for assembling all this contribution. I have had a great time reading it and preparing this comment for you. So, and I think this discussion here is also a small demonstration of how this book can kind of prompt discussions far beyond the South, actually. I'm going to read a bit, but I'm going to it's just because but I'm going to be with you as well. So today I have the delightful task of presenting some thoughts on the from the reading of the book Prison, Inmates and Governance in Latin America, edited by Maximo here. As Richard was saying, the book comprises 12 chapters. 10 of them are substantial, and 2 comments from Maximo, authored by 14 scholars in total. It discusses practices of governance across 8 Latin American countries in which inmates take part in co-determined prison order. That's the topic that unifies all the contributions. One first thing, as just one first general comment, one of the things that struck me as particularly fascinating from the beginning of the reading of the book was the wide range of variation in inmates and prison schemes, governance practices, and this multiplicity covers several dimensions. Just to give one example, for example, in some prisons, inmates governance practice are formalized in law, are described in law, whereas another are just the result of interaction, continuous interaction between inmates or between inmates and prison staff. And I think this variation speaks immediately contradicts an image, not only an uniform image of the prison in general across jurisdiction, but also contradicts a vision of the Latin American prison in particular, right? Not all Latin American prisons are the same, and I think this book shows it really clearly. In that context, there is one particular reading of the book that I would like to highlight today, and this is the way in which this book helps us to think about democratic interactions within the prisons, and especially about the exercise of citizenship by prisoners. I think this is a possible approach because the book analyzes the distribution of power within the prison settings, and of course this has enormous consequences for thinking about democratic arrangements, and particularly because the book it got across all the contributions on this book, the depiction of prisoners as agents, as individuals taking active involvement in the governance of the order in which they are involved. Just to give one example, because there are a lot more in the book, in Peru, women incarcerated in Santa Monica's prison not only elect in some way the representatives, but they have the power of influence and determine their space, their schedules as well, by decorating, but also, for example, remodeling the infrastructure of the prison, and I don't know, organizing holidays or different activities, and organizing the provision of food. In fact, in that same chapter, Lucia Bravo, which is the author, she describes her participants as active subjects in that chapter. And I think beyond the difference between all the cases presented in the book, as I was saying, all of them provide us with an image of active involvement of prisoners and their more or less protagonist role in defining, modifying, and contesting aspects of order in prison settings. And this doesn't mean that prison staff do not play any role, as Maximo and other authors in this book remind us continuously throughout within the chapters. However, it does controvert the simplified image of a prisoner as simply undergoing a pain or a suffering imposed by others, as the legal tradition usually does, or as prisoners living in a social setting in which they cannot determine anything, as for example the image of the total institution will communicate us. And from this image of prisons of prisoners and inmates as agents, I think this image shed light on a debate regarding the conditions of possibility for prisoners to live under the ideal of citizenship and actually be treated as citizens. I think this debate is really like prolific regarding the right to vote to prisoners, but that's something applied regarding the political authorities like outside the prison environment, but not really regarding their power, the political power, to decide the conditions in which they are actually living in. And I think this book offers valuable insights that illustrate some of the possibilities, but also that show us some of the complications of thinking citizenship within the prison. So let's speak first about some of the possibilities of citizen exercise. Politically, we could ask the question, do prisoners have the power to determine their collective space and the time in which they are actually living? In the book, we can see some of these examples. I just named, for example, the case of the woman incarcerated in Santa Monica prison in Peru. But the book also offers other kinds of examples. For example, political organization within the prisons, the participation in the draft of disciplinary or conduct codes for the prison, the election of representatives, the possibility of being actually there like a representative, like for the rest of the inmates, the resolution of conflicts, or even the imposition of consequences for law breaking. Regarding the later, in the Dominican Republic or prison model, inmates that are representantes, which is representatives for Spanish, and form part of the disciplinary committees, actually have the power to solve conflicts and impose punishment for other inmates. On the other hand, according to Navarro and Sozzo, similar would be the case for those in the higher hierarchies in the evangelic wings in Santa Fe in Argentina. They also have the power to impose punishment for some conducts of law breaking. And if we look at political organization, for example, even though the Primero Comando de Capital in general is described as a criminal organization involving illegal activities, I think Diaz-Sala and Alvarez explains well how this organization first began, like it was originated, as a prison association that wanted to oppose state oppression and that wanted to improve the conditions of incarceration for the prisoners. Yeah, and finally, there are a lot of examples like regarding dialogues happening in prisons, and I think I don't know how to pronounce his Dark describes how in some Brazilian prisons, like there is something that he calls as dialogical governance, actually, in which like there is an exercise of dialogue between prison staff and inmates, like following collective interests, not just like private vision or not just like a paternalistic exercise of conversation. Secondly, if we look at or if we wonder about civic citizenship, and even though I think it's very limited and with problematic features, some contributions in the book suggest that some prisons, some prisoners, and in some prisons will have some possibilities to express their individual identities and their opinions. And again, this is the example of this exercise of dialogues, but also the example of the prison in Punta de Rieles, for example, in which prisoners have the ability to have property, to sign contracts, to start businesses inside the prison. And finally, we could ask regarding social and economic citizenship, like whether not only whether the prisoners have access to social and economic services, but what kind of control do they have regarding what kind of social services they access to. And again, I think the case of Punta de Rieles is a good illustration because like beyond the relationship between the prisoner and entrepreneur and the employees of this businessman, all the prisoners in that prison setting have the possibility not just to decide what kind of activities they are going to attend or social services, but they have the opportunity to set up like cultural, social, economics, like services for the rest of the prison population. However, the book not only illustrates possibilities, but also some complications regarding this exercise of citizenship. Whereas this arises from the specific characteristic of the prison as an authoritarian community, as sites actually like name it, or because of the specific role and position with the prisoners, like I usually like within society. I would just highlight three briefly that struck me like as particularly interesting. First, there is a question of equality, like in the exercise of power. And again, the case of the Palgrave is a good example. Here, like as Maximo and Lorena Navarro explained, there is a like stratified social hierarchy within these wings, in which there are like authorities, external and internal, that have power over other inmates, and these other inmates do not have any power to contest. Actually, this authority that is actually based in religious, like in a religious basis, and that sometimes is exercised like following actually personal motives even. And here is personal, like is particularly acute is the problem of inflicting solitary confinement to other prisoners. Second, I would say like it's really necessary to keep in mind that even though like prisoners are despite are portrayed as agents, they are still in the control of the state. So we could ask whether like this control provides actually like the conditions necessarily for real democratic interactions. The book, I think, provides a more complex view regarding this obstacle, because on the one hand, we have the possibilities of political autonomy, as I was saying like before, the political organization of the Primero Comando Capital is a good example. But also it shows how apparent inmate participation, or actually actual inmate participation, can be at least partially a disguise or an extension of state control. As Julian Weber explains in her chapter, the consejos, who are like inmates elected by the prison population, following the law, actually, have the main function of supervising and controlling inmates in several dimensions of prison life. And in addition, we could ask, like, we could say that no matter how much freedom an inmate will have within the prison, probably there is always someone who will have the power to decide what kind of activity or what kind of discourse counts as good, as something that is approved. And again, I will take the example of Punta de Reales, in which like we could ask this almost like really good example of a prison, like respecting like human rights of the prisoners' human rights, but at the same time there is always this administrator who decides what activity counts as really good and valuable and what doesn't count as such. And first, I will say like there is a question about the moral and political status of the prisoners. Especially considering that with imprisonment, there is always this implicit message that prisoners do not belong anymore to a political community of equals. So the question is like, how much power or autonomy do we want to give, or would we want someone who has committed a crime and is incarcerated to have? Or whether is it a voice in which we can trust? And I think when explaining the form of dialogic governance that emerges in the inmate and staff interaction, Stegeman Getter, one of the authors, explicitly addressed this problem, and I am going to quote: through dialogue, social conformity is produced by taking into account their collective voices with the risk of giving prisoners excessive power. And I think, like, from my point of view, this is a justified concern, especially if we, look, for example, the illegal activities that go well beyond the prison borders of the Primero Comando Capital in Brazil, the extreme violence involved in La Ley de la Vallada, I don't know how to translate this, like the French law, in Nicaragua, or the arbitrary power of evangelical authorities or other inmates following, as I was saying, sometimes even personal motives in Santa Fe. I think here the tension between the autonomy necessarily to exercise citizenship and the control of the state that is necessary for these settings reappears. And we will ask the normative question, what kind of citizenship is reasonable, justifiable to build for prisoners? Being aware of the potential consequences of disorder, violence, criminal activities, human rights violation under control of the state, that this book, I think, well exposed. Well, just to conclude, because yeah, I know it has been long, considering all this, I think the main question is what kind of opportunities or possibilities are for democratic interactions in prisons. And yeah, I think this book opens our imagination in several ways. In particular, personally, I think that a promising line to move forward would be continue exploring and studying this exercise and practices of dialogue between those actors that are in prisons. And yeah, I think that would be like a really way of moving forward. And probably Maximo is going to talk more about the dialogue between South and North. But just I wanted to say that I think this is a wonderful example how a book can produce in the South by authors of the South, from the South, can like help us to construct counter-hegemonic views regarding places of confinement. So yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you for
so much. Now it's my turn. So thank you everybody for coming here, and thank you particularly to Richard for having the idea of doing this, and for both of them for reading in such a detailed way the book. I think it's well, it's a privilege to discuss with you these ideas that are contained in the book. I could talk a lot, of course, about it, but I will not do it. I really try to constrain myself to these 15-20 minutes that we have been discussing with Richard. So first, the book is about inmate governance, we can say, and its concept, I think it's interesting. Sasha Darke has presented this concept some 10 years ago, thinking about the reality of prisons in Brazil. And I think it's quite interesting to use it and also to discuss it a bit. So we are talking about mechanisms in which some prisoners assume roles to govern other prisoners, conducting their conduct. We want to use the expression of Michel Foucault in The Subject and the Power, acting on the possibilities of their action and ordering the possible outcomes. And I think inmate governance is really a main characteristic of prison life today in Latin America, across Latin America. But as Fernanda highlighted, this happens with a huge level of variation. And I think this is another important contribution of the book, trying to first produce this image that we are not, when we talk about prisons in Latin America, we are not talking about the prison in Latin America, as, you know, as an homogeneous entity, but there are many different situations. The book presents in-depth studies of some of these schemes of inmate governance, but there are also many others that are not included in it. Another important point that Richard mentioned, and I think it's really important to highlight, is that this book is the product of years of empirical research by all these friends and colleagues that have been doing work, in some occasions only in one prison in a national context, in other occasions in several prisons in the same national context, but with a huge amount of effort, investment in time, and being there. You know, this is, I think it's a very, very important element. And of course, this is part of a broader, let's say, trend in social studies about prisons in Latin America that has been evolved in the last 10, 15 years. And it's very interesting because, for example, even there you can find this dialogue between North and South, because we have colleagues in the book that are based in universities in Latin America, and colleagues that are based in universities in Global North, colleagues that are you know, they came from Latin America, but also colleagues that do not. So I think that's like Julien or Sasha. So I think Julien Wiggles and Sasha that. So I think this is also very interesting. And the process of making this book has been very intensive. We have been working for 4 years, meeting many times, discussing many times the work by each of us. So I think that this is also could be seen in the book, that it's a product of a dialogue between all of us. What one can label as a South dialogue, but also with this element of people in the North participating actively in this dialogue in a very bilateral, instead richer, equal way of producing this kind of dialogue. So I think I would like to highlight. So understanding the variations in the schemes of inmate governance is very difficult, and the book, I think, only make a first step in this direction, and we need a huge amount more work in order to fully do it. But I think that there are at least some elements, dimensions that we can think when we consider this variation between schemes of inmate governance in Latin America. First, the degrees of autonomy of inmates. Fernanda mentioned very many times the word autonomy. How much autonomy these schemes give to the different prisoners that enact these, perform these governance roles in relation to the prison authorities, prison officers. Also, Fernanda mentioned it, the degree of symmetry or asymmetry between these different actors. Because we have examples in which, there are reversing this very old truth about the prison as a context of relations, that there is this structural inequality in the level of power and capacity between state agents and prisoners as agents. There are some examples in which the level of symmetry is surprising, like this chief of the evangelical wings in provincial prisons in Argentina that could give orders to a prison officer. For example, he decided that somebody has to go to solitary confinement for a period of time. He directly tell the prison officer what he has to do. So he has to open the gate, he has to go with him and the prisoner to the sector of the prison in which the isolation cells are, and the prisoner that is the chief of the evangelical wing is the one who communicates to him what he has to do and why, because he made explicitly comment on the reason why this prisoner has to spend some days in solitary confinement. And at the same time, the same chief, we call it pastor, shepherd, the pastor is the one who will decide when this solitary confinement stops. And the proceeding is exactly the same. So, and you can see there levels of symmetry that are quite surprising. So I think this is the second very important dimension. Because in other schemes, the asymmetry is much more clear. So, for example, the delegadas in the prison of Santa Monica in Lima, in Peru, that Lucia Bracco studying this chapter, but also in a book that has been recently published, and it's very interesting, are in many ways, in many situations, considered by the other prisoners, the delegadas, the delegates, are considered like the longa man of the prison authorities. I mean, the persons who develop some roles because they have been authorized by the prison authorities, and in some way they depend from prison authorities. So there the level of asymmetry is much more marked. So the third dimension that I think is very, very important is the degree or the level of confrontation. Some of these schemes have been constructed in a process that one can think using the idea of the conquest, you know. Some agents have conquered these possibilities, these capacities of governing some sector of prison life. For example, when we think about evangelical wings in the provincial prisons in Argentina, there is, of course, an acceptance to the existence of these evangelical wings produced by prison authorities and also by political authorities who are in charge of the prison service. But there is a history there of fighting for these kind of spaces inside the prisons, both by prisoners themselves, but also particularly by ministers from evangelical churches outside prison, who have been since the 1980s very constantly fighting, struggling with the prison services that were in general in Argentina associated with the Catholic Church, in order to let them enter into the prison and evangelize the prisoners and finally produce these kind of spaces. And we can say the same thing of these criminal organizations, as we label many times in the Latin American literature, that are, you know, there is a huge debate about this concept. Some authors also use prison gangs, importing the concept from the USA, and we can go back to this, like Primeiro Comando de Capital, Comando Vermelho in Brazil, but also organizations that are not so strong as the PCC or Comando Vermelho, because they do not govern many prisons or prisons across different states. They do not have such a dominant position in the market of illegal drugs in several cities or in several states. But there are also more modest criminal organizations that produce a huge level of capacity to govern what is going on inside the prison in some of the chapters of this book. For example, in the very interesting chapter by Andrés Antillano on Venezuela, that we can see there what he, in the Venezuelan prison slang, they call it El Carro. There is a prison organization inside a single prison that probably do not have a strong connections outside and is not present in other prisons, but in many, many senses, they are very, very strong and confront against the state. Fernanda said this, talking about the very interesting chapter by Camila Diaz, Fernando Sala, Marcos Cesar Alvarez on schemes of inmate governance in Sao Paulo state in Brazil, that the PCC have in some way been created using a language of opposition against the state. A guerra nas ruas, no? The war in the streets, but also inside the prisons. And I think that's a very interesting element of confrontation. The fourth dimension that I think is really, really important is the scope of these practices of inmate governance, the reach they have. Because, for example, in the evangelical wings, it's very clear that the shepherd and his hierarchy can govern what is going on inside the wing, and they do not govern the entire prison. But in some context, the criminal organizations really govern an entire prison, and the state, in some way, is in charge of the custody of the frontiers of the prison, of what enters into the prison and what exits the prison. That is a very, very important element. That is why it's not the absence of the state, it's much more complex. A fifth dimension that I think is very, very important is the degree of complexity. So we have now some social research about how the PCC, the Primeiro Comando de Capital, is now present in prisons in Paraguay, Uruguay, and Uruguay. So it's becoming a transnational criminal organization. So that implies a level of complexity in this structure of the organization that has nothing to do with the prisoner entrepreneur or the prisoner. The real is that it's a single individual who has his own business and who is in charge of other prisoners who are his employees. And of course, he governs the other prisoners to a certain extent while they are working for him in the business. But it's very, very limited in its scope. The fifth, and I think it's a crucial element, is the degree of violence. It says in the book, but I think that we have to also expand more, is the degree of exploitation of prisoners by other prisoners. That some of these inmate scheme mechanisms clearly present. There are many of them that really present high doses of violence and exploitation. But again, not all of them. No, there are very peaceful schemes of, and even very egalitarian schemes of inmate governance also in place in some context of Latin America. And finally, the degree of formalization, that I think it's a very important thing. We are witnessing in the last 20 years some reaction by prison legislation and policy that is saying, in some context of Latin America, let's create some sort of participation of inmates in how we govern prison. And as Fernanda said many times, this is very complex. It has a lot of problems, but at the same time, it's very interesting because in some ways, an attempt to introduce a certain doses of democratization in an autocratic space like the prison, in a despotic space like the prison. So I think if we consider these 7 dimensions, we can see the huge level of violation. That's why one of the, and this is my third point, one of the main debates in the book, but in general in the literature on these schemes of inmate governance, is the debate about the concepts of self-governance and co-governance that you will find in different moments in the book. And this is very, very interesting for many reasons. Richard mentioned one, that is the connection with Sykes and the Society of Captives. That is a post-hoc connection. Because in many of the authors that have been working using the concepts of self-governance or co-governance, Sykes was simply not there. For many different reasons, was not a main source in the work. So the concept of self-governance or co-governance emerged out of their empirical work and their own inventiveness. And of course, then, when you begin to find the points in common with the elaborations of Sykes about this micropolitics, as Richard said, of the construction of order inside the prison, you see a lot of things that really are interesting. And even you find, as I have done it, even expressions in the work of Sykes that talk a lot about these concepts. He uses it in the book, but very laterally, the expression self-governance in different, or self-control in different moments. But it's also very interesting. It's not that the authors or the researchers are departing from Sykes, but in a way they are only now, producing a dialogue with Sykes that I think is very interesting. This is a debate that I think is crucial because both concepts have their dark sides, let's say. One, in the concept of self-governance, the image of the absence of the state. That is, the idea that, and this is strongly connected with these visions that are homogenized prisons in Latin America, that talk about the prison in Latin America. So, well, in the prison in Latin America, prisoners govern themselves in a very anarchic, violent, and exploitative way. Not like us in the north. We are civilized, and we govern what is going on inside prisons in a very different way that is modern, developed, has all positive connotations. So I think that no, this is very problematic, of course, imagine, but I think that this element of the absence of the state is really problematic because the state is not absent at all, even in the cases in which the scope and capacity of the inmates who produce strategies of governance inside prisons is the highest, like in the Primeiro Comando de Capital example. There are constant negotiations with the state. As my friend and colleague Andres Santillana always said, trash. In a prison, you produce a lot of trash. And in order to get the trash out of the prison, you need to establish a certain degrees of commitment. And if you want to have an AK-47 or cocaine inside the prison, you also need to have some level of agreements with prison officers. And it happens all the time. But also this idea that, even in these cases, what the state is doing is only to administer what enter and what exit the prison is also problematic. Because in many of these situations, the state or the state agents, not the state agents, decided to enter into the prison and change what is going on in the state. In many occasions, using extreme levels of force, of violence, in order to be effective. So I think it's a more complex picture that many times the self-governance produce. By the other side, the idea of co-governance that have been developed by the authors as a way of reacting to this problem of the concept of self-governance also have another problem, that in many of its uses implies the constant presence of collaboration between the state and its agents and the prisoners as agents of governance. As you know, the only thing that is going on is cooperation and collaboration, and this is very problematic because these relations also imply tensions and conflicts, and we lost sight of them, of this, if we really do not take it into consideration. But even the construction of these concepts also talk us about the level of variation, because in some way has been used in this direction. And it's very interesting, going to my fourth point, and I promise it's the last one, going to this dialogue between South and North, and we can talk a lot about it if you want. There is also, for example, in the recent work by David Scarbeck on how prisons are governed globally, a very ambitious book that has been published in 2020, a use of these concepts of self-governance and co-governance as different types of prison governance. And we can see there, in his own appropriation of this debate coming from Latin America, a way of, in some way, do not discarding one of these two concepts, but using both together in order to classify different types of prison governance. I do not agree at all, but I think it's interesting how he solves this theoretical problem. And at the same time, it is interesting how the book expresses some sort of dialogue between North and South that is not in the typical direction of, the North illuminating the South following the path of the North. Finally, I promise it's the last point that I would like to make. There are many others, but I think it is very important, the contribution that the book makes in order to talk about differences between prisons in different parts of the world. And not only, between South and North. I think that we have discussed all this on Friday. I will not go back to this, but there are many different Souths, different ways of being the South. And there are also very different ways of being the North. But I think that we have to pay more attention about how we discuss about differences. Because particularly when we have these two references, North, South, center, periphery, in many occasions, the way we talk about differences produces essentializing effects, producing these ideas of radical differences with a lot of orientalizing. I discussed in one of the chapters, particularly the work by Chris Birbeck in this sense, and I think it's one interesting example of doing what I think we don't have to do, that is producing this kind of differences of types. And I think that we can imagine many different examples today in different contexts that could be labeled as global north, in which prisoners play different kinds of governmental roles. The only thing is that we have to be more aware, and we have to look at it and not just assume that the contemporary prison have finally realized the utopia or dystopia of total control by state agents.
So, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, we've got about half an hour.
Yeah, we've got about half an hour for a discussion. I'm sure there are many questions people have, both online here and in person. So if people do have questions, then please raise your hand and I'll give you a little nod when I've spotted you. I'm going to run a little a list here. If you have a follow-up, maybe just give me a little half hand, so that if there's a question, there's a discussion you want to jump in on, you can do that. Although we are a bit tight for time, so I'll maybe limit that somewhat. And for those of you who are online, just a Q for a question or an F for a follow-up. And you can, hopefully using the OWL, you can present the question yourself, or you can type it into the chat and I can present the question for you. So the floor is now open if anyone does have any questions, or we've got one already. So Deborah, why don't you? And can I just say, just because the OWL is here, if you can be quite loud and project when you give your question, and maybe start with your name as well, so we know who's talking, that'd be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Deborah, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing this. I think it's brilliant and it's so insightful. So my question, so if I compare, I look at Scottish prisons and the degree of non-agency that this just strikes me now. So I have two questions. One is more like at the micro level. At what point? So there's a lot of trust that is given to these prisoners in terms of their governing abilities. And if I compare it to Scottish prisons, for example, where prisoners are infantilized and they're not given any agency because they're not considered even capable of, I just wonder at what point, was it out of necessity that this took place from a historical point of view, or I just wonder, there's a lot of trust. And I just wonder how that plays out. And the other question I have is, obviously prisons are a reflection of our society generally. So organized crime, organized, in South America, how does that, obviously in society, that reflects itself in the prison system? And to what extent is that the case? Yes. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Deborah. Both are very interesting. I would say that there was a point that I jumped, that is, why these schemes of inmate governance have been multiplied and expanded during the last 20, 30 years, and it's a very interesting debate. I will not go through all of it. But I think it is really important, because in some of the answers about this why appears the idea that the only dynamic that explain why these inmate governance schemes are produced is the delegation by prison authorities and prison officers that is connected with trust. In English, you have this word that in Spanish doesn't exist, trustee, and has been used quite a lot in the old days of particularly of prison studies in the US in the 50s and 60s. So the idea that there is somebody in the community of prisoners who is selected by the prison authorities and given the trust to develop these kind of activities of production of overwork. And I think this is certainly true for some of these schemes, but it's certainly not true for others of these schemes. So when we talk about the genealogy of the Primeiro Comando da Capital, we talk a lot about the Primeiro Comando da Capital, not only because of the impact of this organization, but also because in the Brazilian social sciences, it's probably the most researched example of this kind of organizations. So when we talk about the genealogy of the PCC and how it has been constructed in this dominant position in many prisons of the state of Sao Paulo in the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s, well, there are nothing like trust there. There is another type of dynamic. So one of the other whys that have been used quite a lot is saying, well, the state is not capable of ordering, of governing what is going on inside prisons. And that is why things like the PCC could be constructed and become dominant in these prisons in the state of Sao Paulo or other states. Again, I think this could be a very interesting explanation for some of these schemes. Probably the ones in which, in context in which all the indicators about the capacity of the state to govern and administer prisons show us a very, let's say, weak status. But we have also schemes of inmate governance in contexts like Argentina or Uruguay, two contexts in which the right of prison officers per inmates is the same as in England and Wales. So it's not a complete explanation. That is why I am not convinced by the uses of these concepts, co-governance and self-governance by David Scarbeck, because in his way of thinking about these schemes, the only reason behind it is the weak state governance, the ineffective state governance. And I don't agree with that. So I think trust is part of it in some occasions, but it's not in others. And it's connected with these confronting views of delegation, outsourcing, probably you would say in English, the state delegating the power to govern in some inmates, in the inmates community. And the contrast is with another image of the conquest, inmates conquering practices of governance. In both situations, prisoners as agents appear quite clearly. That's mechanisms. And about the second point on organized crime, well, of course I agree that we in order to understand part of the reality of what is going on inside prisons, paying attention to these complex organizations that develop different kind of activities, particularly in the market of illegal drugs, but also in other kind of criminal activities, is very, very important. But there is also in Latin American social sciences today some sort of exaggeration about the uses of organized crime. Everything is organized crime. So that if there are 7 guys that could control 3 wings, they are criminal organization, and they are really 7 guys. But they have, of course, they have certain capacity, but there are 7. No more than that. They are not rich. They are not Pablo Escobar. They are really, guys from one neighborhood that have some connections. Probably they could smuggle some illegal drugs, some arms every now and then, but no more. With that, I want to say that, of course, it's very important, but particularly in the public debate, but even in the social sciences today, this concept of organized crime many times appear like a phantom, that everything is, and I react against it in a way, say, well, let's see if this carro in this Venezuelan prison is really, a complex organized crime organization, although there are many that really, this label applies quite well.
Okay, so next we've got Milena, who's online. So if you can try and unmute yourself, and let's see if we've got a sound.
Okay, tell me if you can hear me. If you can't, then hi. Sorry, Maximo, I was meaning to be there, but circumstances. So I just had one question. I was really interested in this because idealistically, we might take what you're talking about as an indication of the status of prisoners as citizens. So if you can use it as a measurement of their citizenship status. And I think, what you're saying, obviously, given all the differences and the nuances, but it might suggest that those prisons in which you do have a high level of self-governance might indicate that the prisoners have a perpetual citizenship status. I'm just wondering the extent to which you can perhaps compare this to the external dimension, and just kind of see whether those prisons in which there's a high level of self-governance are located in those geographical areas where prisoners also have voting rights as well. Because I'm thinking about this as obviously prisons are places in which the self-governance is already exists within the context of limited self-governance, right? So it's already limited by the fact that they're in prison. So I'm just wondering whether there's any correlation with kind of the external perspective whereby these prisoners also have voting rights, because then that would give us, I guess, a more complete picture of whether their citizenship status is still is perpetual or not. So that was the only question. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Milena. It's very, very interesting. And I wrote something when Fernanda also made this point that I think it's really puzzling. I have to think much more about it. I didn't do it, but I think that there are some of these schemes of inmate governance in this language of citizenship and rights is present, and some which is not at all. So, for example, examples like the evangelical wings or the Carro in Venezuela or the PCC are examples in which there is nothing of this kind of connection. But there are some, I am very interested in these other ones, in which there is an explicit use of ideas of citizenship and rights. And the delegadas in the prison of Santa Mónica in Lima, in Peru, in the origin, the Consejo de Representantes in Nicaraguan prisons that were studied by Julian Wiggles. In fact, Nicaragua is one of the countries in which this participation of inmates in the process of producing order inside the prison has been legalized. Nicaragua, Panama, Costa Rica, several countries in Central America have experienced reforms of the prison laws in the 1990s and 2000s, producing these schemes of inmate participation in governance. And I have been doing a study in my own province of an experience that has also used the concept of dialogue. The name of the experience is Tables of Dialogue, that have represented some sort of formalization of this image. So I think that in these examples, we can see this attempt to entitle prisoners with the the identity of citizens and with the idea of rights. Although they have a lot of other problems that we can also discuss, how we select the representatives of the prisoners' community, if the prison authorities really respect the desires of the prisoner communities or manipulate the process of selection, if before they have these dialogues, the prison authorities manipulate the demands that these prisoners will present in these spaces in order to manipulate the outcomes of the dialogue, and so many other problems. And I think that beyond all these problems, I found all these experiences completely fascinating, politically, moving. And I think that we in Latin America have to do a lot more research on these experiences, on its pitfalls, but also on its positive elements in the cases in which we can find those positive elements. And just to a brief note from the field work, I have been this research that I am now doing about these tables of dialogue with a colleague sparked from a dialogue with a prisoner inside a male prison in my province, in the province in Argentina. And he told me his history as a prisoner and how he has been one delegate in this table of dialogues that existed only between 2003 and 2011 in this province. And he made all this narrative about the meaning of the tables of dialogues for the community of prisoners. And after listening to him for something like an hour and a half, I said, well, there is a very, very also positive and interesting experience, because he's really a political agent in many, many ways, the language, how he presents the problems of the prisons. So I think, and I think this is a product of his role in that experience. So I think it has many interesting. And again, if we think about these attempts in the global north, we have also there a very interesting line of dialogue. Because even in the UK, although this treatment of prisoners as non-agents that you mentioned before here in Scotland, there are several small experiences of, in some way, mechanisms that attempt to build democracy inside the prison. Bethany Schmidt has done very interesting research on this. And I think that in other places there are others. So I think that there is also a very interesting line of research across the north and the south.
Right, so next we have Katrina, who again is online. So I'm just going to, if you can unmute, and we'll take your question next.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you very much for the discussion so far. I sort of realize how refreshing it is to think about different questions as a prisons researcher after listening to you all talking for just over an hour. So thank you very much for that. So my questions really relate a little bit to the ones that have already been asked, but not exactly. So first of all, about how prisons in Latin America reflect wider traditions sort of nationally and across the whole of the continent, as another way of trying to understand why this is happening. And I'm also really interested in the question why, and I know you said you don't have enough time to talk about that, but I wonder, does it reflect a greater tradition of democracy within sort of, I simplistically think of, the great tradition of like socialism in Latin America or something, which is probably hugely simplistic and not entirely, and it's got a lot more nuance than that. But I wonder if there's something about this sort of greater tradition maybe that explains this, and whether we also see more democracy in other social institutions such as schools or workplaces or anything else which might help explain what's happening in prisons. And also I wondered whether prisoners are less stigmatized perhaps than they are in places where there is less self-governance in prison, and whether that was a kind of factor as well. And I suppose related to that was the bigger question of how the public, if there is public awareness of this, how do they respond to the idea that people in prison are to some extent in control over aspects of their lives. So that, and I also have a question about prison officers, but I don't want to monopolize you too much. But I wondered how prison officers, you can maybe leave this, and then if there's time, let somebody else ask a question. But then if there's nobody else, then I will have a question about how prison officers respond to all of this as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katrina. It's very, all the points are very interesting. I want to say that from the start that inmate governance doesn't mean democratization. You know, there are two different things. You know, there are some schemes of inmate governance that you can think that could be connected with the ideas of producing democratization, citizenship rights, but there are others that it's impossible to connect with this. So from the PCC to evangelical wings, you know, there are many things there that, but not democratization, rights or citizenship. So, so this is connected with my answer. I would not say, of course, that in American prisons we have a long-standing tradition that is connected with ideas of democracy. Neither in society more generally. We have experienced within the 20th century huge periods of time of authoritarian political regimes that have produced strong legacies in politics, culture, and society even today. And particularly in the 1960s and 70s, across Latin America, this has been really diffused and produced extreme impacts in these penal institutions in general, police forces, criminal justice administration, and particularly prisons. But after saying this, there is interesting that there are very few, but there are some connections between the experience of political imprisonment during the military dictatorships, civic military dictatorships of the 1970s and 80s, and some of these schemes of inmate governance. So, for example, in the genealogy of the Primeiro Comando da Capital, there has been quite proved today by different researchers how the first inmates who in some way began to construct this organization has had a strong connection with political prisoners during the military civic dictatorship in Brazil that ended in 1985. And in fact, this could explain the political language that is present in the experience of the PCC. So there is this motto of the PCC, justice, peace, and liberty, that are very important elements. And the language of, you know, fighting the state as an oppressor, it has a lot of connections with the experience of political imprisonment and the prisoners who came from leftist traditions. But this is probably the only, you know, connection that we can think of. And in relation to the prison officers, that again is very interesting, but it has huge levels of variation. So there are situations in which these schemes have today a strong support by prison officers, because in some cases even they have created them. So one of the studies in this book is one we did with Fernando Avila on this very atypical prison in Montevideo, the capital city of Uruguay, called Punta de Rieles. Fernanda made reference to this several times. And the peculiarities of this prison that is labeled the prison town or the prison neighborhood is that, you know, there is a huge level of autonomy for prisoners there, and there are an immense quantity of activities done by the prisoners, from economic activities of production of goods and services to cultural activities, educational activities. There is no solitary confinement. The prisoners walk around the space of the prisoner all the time from 7 a.m. till 8 p.m. and they are not subject to any kind of intensive control. So in that prison, this prison is the result of of a prison governor. So in some way, or a couple of prison governors who have been the ones who invented this way of doing things and produced it practically. So the scheme of inmate governance in place in this prison, the role particularly of prisoner entrepreneurs, there are 55 different businesses inside the prison that work there. So has been not only tolerated by the prison authorities and officers, but they have created in the first place. So from there to the absolute opposition of some prison officers in relation to criminal organizations in many different contexts, there is a huge level of variation in the reactions by prison. I think there was another point, but I forget it. So,
I think it was about all the social spaces in which this demographic.
That's, yeah, I think it's, of course, there are many other spaces in social life in which we can think of processes of extreme and radical democratization. We are today on March 8th, the Women's Day in Latin America, and this is probably the best example of all of them. We have seen the last 20 years in Latin America what we call a green wave, what Fernanda has here the handkerchief. Okay. And so this wave of the movement of women, that is a fantastic and radical experience of democratization that has produced a huge level of impact. Democratization, I mean, as a space of political activity and cultural activity, but also producing impacts towards democratization. In my country, in Argentina, we can consider, you know, from changes in the legislation about sexual and gender identity to the decriminalization of abortion. So it's probably one of the countries in which this has produced the most important and clear effects. But in what measure, again, this is connected with what is going on inside prisons. I would be very, very cautious about it. And again, because not all inmate governance schemes implies democratization. So, but in some occasions, we can find this connection. For example, in the Punta de Rieles experience, the experience is created, as I have already said, by two governors, prison governors, who were civilians, who were not part of the prison service. And both of them came from experiences of what we call in Latin America popular education. I mean, activities trying to produce educational activities in poor neighborhoods, in marginalized neighborhoods. There is a long-standing tradition of this practice in Latin America from the 1960s onwards around what we call the pedagogy of emancipation or the pedagogy of liberation. Both these guys have been formed in this tradition, and in fact they have used it quite a lot in order to build this style of doing things inside the prison. So there are connections. I don't want to say that there are not a single connection, but I would not say that in all the examples we can find it.
Okay, do you still have a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Clécio. I'm Brazilian. I'm the Brazilian one. So actually I live here since last year, and I'm a lecturer at UWS for criminology, Southern Criminology. It's such a, I was never expecting in my life that one day we're going to be here speaking about prisons in Latin America. And actually it's a topic that I have been researching in the last years. I did ethnographical study on prisons in Maceió, in the north of Brazil. And of course, it's very ambitious this to have like to establish such patterns concerning inmates and governance in Brazil, in Latin America, because if you go to one prison in Maceió or in Brazil, so you can have like different modules, different places inside of the prison, and you also have different ways of governance in those prisons. So if you are in a prison that people is waiting for a sentence, for example, they are going to behave or also manage this governance in a specific way. If you are in a maximum imprisonment unit, so it's totally different the way that they are going to behave, they are going to manage this, the governance side of the prison. What is very interesting is that prison, I mean, I'm speaking about prison, is a very complicated, difficult place to go in. I mean, usually you don't have an authorization to go inside of the prison. So that's why we have in the 90s, I think it was the first time in our history that we have prison in the TV because of this demonstration, which was headed by the PCC, the Comando da Capital, which is not the first facção in Brazil. Actually, the first facção in Brazil is it was in Rio de Janeiro. That's why they have this kind of relationship with dictatorship, the military dictatorship at the time. They learned how to organize.
Sorry, but the name of that first faction, as they call it in Brazilian literature, is Comando Vermelho. That means red command. So it's again to this connection with political imprisonment is very clear.
Yeah. So and it was the first time that we see prison as something that belongs to society actually. So we have like you switch on the TV and you see, of course, in a negative way because they are like firing everything. And it was a way to protect the conditions inside of the prison. And it was in this way, more or less, that it emerged as a group, which nowadays is more a criminal organization, an international criminal organization, because it's deeply connected with the drug trade. But it was interesting to see that it's clear that it's a very complex environment. So if you go, for example, women prison, they are, I mean, you have like a less amount of people in those units, and they have like freedom to organize the space. It's a different space. Actually, it's a more nice space to be usually in a community prison than a main prison. So my question is so go inside of the prison and see this difference between the units. You can also see that in some of them in those places where you have the convicted inmates. So you usually have like an overpopulation in those places. So and then it's not possible for the state to have the control of those spaces because they have like in Marcel, for example, we had this unit for those who already have a sentence, who knows exactly how many years they're going to stay in those places. And you have at the time 600 people in a prison that have capacity for 200, 250. And then you have this different space full of people, and you can even not go inside of those places. So that's why you need leadership in those places. So, and of course they have to do this for themselves. They have to organize like a human movement, just organize a space and put some rules and how are you going to live inside of those places. My question is any kind of patterns in Latin America just focus on the relationship between overcrowded prisons and the necessity of leadership of governance for the part of the prison. And actually, I can here see this kind of more democratic, whatever you want to call this, in such kinds of prison. Usually, I mean, in the case of Brazil, we have a part of the prison with definitely those called workers. So you don't have like access to work, but there are like a few people who has access to work in those prisons. Usually these groups like more organized, they have like more trust, they have more because they work 3 days just to have 1 day free. And they're going to calculate at the end just to be like on the street earlier than established by the sentence. And this is like exactly what the state wants to us to see as a prison model. So it's not like the reality that you can see when we're inside of those prisons. So I just want to raise that, and I was like very interested about the role of religion in Argentina, because the role of religion in a prison in Brazil is made the only way that someone can go out of a criminal organization. And also is a way to clean your record, because in the prisons in Brazil, it's a pattern in the whole country. You have a subcategory of people, those who committed sexual crimes, who killed the mother or the father, or who is accused by rape. For example, they cannot stay together with those from the Primeiro Comando da Capital, or for drug dealers, because they're going to die. It's a rule inside of the prison. So you cannot, it is a category of crime that's even prohibited in the criminal world. And so they use also religion as a way to go out of this image, and also to go out of the criminal organization, because they don't want to have people out of the criminal organization or the facções such as the PCC and Comando Vermelho, because they know too much about how it happens inside of the.
I'm just going to cut in there because we are now approaching 25 to 6. So I just want to, if you can give like headline points, and then at the drinks reception, we can have a further discussion just so we can bring the official thing to a close. But thanks so much.
Very, very, very interesting. There are many different points there that are really, really. I think that there is a strong connection between extreme situations of overcrowding and the development of these image governance schemes. No doubt. You know, and the case of Brazil has been, you know, we have a lot of research in the last 10 years that show us very clearly this, you know, for example, the work by Sasha Dark's book called Reality and Survival. I was before trying to say that this, let's say, weakness of the state agents to control what is going on is not the only factor, but not because I don't think it is a factor. It's a very, very important factor. But the problem I find is that in many cases in which we are talking about these email governance schemes in general, this is elevated to the status of the cost of that creates everything. And I don't think it's the single cause, but I completely agree that is something that happens. And going back to religion, there are many interesting parallels here. And you said something that I think is very, very important also. When we talk about variation of these schemes of governance, is because of human governance. We also have to consider that this variation could even exist in the state prison. That's a very, very important point that in many occasions we lost. You know, the evangelical wings could coexist with wings that are governed by the PCC or by the Carro in Venezuela. So, and this also talk us about the complexity, not only of different prisons inside the prison system that also happens, but also differences inside one single prison. And indeed, the passage from the wings that are considered religious wings and the other wings is a very interesting thing. And we have found in Argentina, but also other colleagues have found narratives about how narratives, of course, of conversion, religious conversion is an important element to understanding, but also narratives of escaping from the hands of the criminal organization or the tensions and conflicts inside this other wing, and the fiction of conversion, and the guy is saying, well, I have to produce this performance about it, because it's the only way to get in there. But also, on the other side, we have also narratives of these pastores, these shepherds, saying, we know that they are not comparative. So it's interesting.
That's pretty interesting.
Right, I will bring things to an official close. Of course, we now have a drinks reception. There should hopefully be stuff waiting outside. If there's not, I'll have to chase it up. But I just want to thank everyone again for coming along, and if you could join me in thanking Maximo and the whole panel. Thanks very much. See you at the next one. And thank you everyone for joining online.